Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to share with you some insights today on integrating ESG and what boards and senior executives are looking for out of internal audit, risk management, compliance teams. When you think about ESG, and I want to level set here with everyone, what does ESG really mean? So you've got the E, the S, the G, E being environmental risks, and a lot of this has to do with sustainability. And sustainability as it relates to issues like climate change, but also sustainability as it relates to how organizations are working with others in their communities, in their locales, but also globally with other business partners in reaching new levels of performance. And this performance, I would say, is around more operational concerns and how organizations are driving that impact to, for example, climate change through their use of newer technologies, reducing their own direct impact on sustainability issues, or choosing to work with other suppliers, other vendors, other business partners who may be doing more as it relates to sustainability, so more indirect type of impact, but also looking for ways that they may be able to offset some of the bad things that they've been doing, through the use of credits that they may purchase from a carbon footprint perspective. You see a lot of carbon accounting practices taking place with organizations and running through their various ERP solutions to get a better sense of what they're doing. And those things are all, I think, well intended, but they're driving a lot of investment activity, a lot of consumer buying behavior for folks who are looking for those organizations that are doing a better job. And you also have risk rating agencies, very similar to credit rating agencies on the financial risk side of things, who are now producing ratings related to how an organization actually performs in their independent objective view. And so all of this is increasing the focus on sustainability as a risk imperative and driver in 2022. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we start to move forward. It really is a big topic of discussion, but also for boards and senior leaders, it's impacting their strategies very heavily. The second risk imperative or risk driver, as I would say, is soundness. And soundness, again, I would say relates mainly to the E, or the environmental piece, in that organizations are facing all sorts of external risk events, and they need to make sure that those risk events, when they occur, that they're able to respond and recover from a given event very quickly. And so on the environmental side, it's not only climate events that may be impacting organizations, with natural disasters or other sorts of weather events that may have a significant impact on operations across the globe, and then resulting in disruptions to supply chains, you name it. But it could also be more environmental risks from a, say, technological standpoint. So it's the technological environment that we see contributing to a lot of the cyber risk, which ties into security, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the disruption it can have there. But also, thinking about even broader environmental risks as it relates to geopolitical environment. Certainly we have the war in Ukraine having a major impact, but also just various decisions by governments as it relates to regulation, compliance, and we're starting to see, I think, competing regulation in this space as it relates to ESG with other countries calling for greater disclosure on ESG. In fact, in the UK, they already have enacted regulation for their listed companies to disclose ESG risks in their annual reports, and also certainly material risks on an as-needed basis. And then also in the EU, there's a lot of focus and legislation working through their EU system, and will be, I would say, enacted probably in the next year or so. So, my guess is looking to 2024 as being the real first year of the major regulation hit, where a lot of the soundness could be impacted, but it also could impact the safety of the organizations in play. And this is where we start to get more into the S of the ESG, or the social aspect. So making sure that organizations' employee base, or the customers they serve, or really the social needs and aspects of those key stakeholders that are involved in the organization's success, making sure that their business is conducted ethically and from the standpoint of safety to those individual constituents, if you will. And so risk assurance is going to be a major driver, certainly in 2022 and beyond. And certainly will have a greater impact on audit, risk, and compliance professionals to help senior business leaders and board members to create that safe environment. And then finally, on the security end, and this I would say goes not only to the S of ESG, or the social nature of it, but also the G, the governance. And here it's all about certainly ensuring that organizations have very solid compliance with IT and cybersecurity requirements, in making sure that data, for example, from a privacy perspective, is also a major objective of the board, of the senior leadership, in ensuring that the data is used appropriately. And from a privacy perspective, certainly, EU, it's a big push through GDPR, and then here in the US, certainly through state level initiatives like California with CCPA. But even beyond privacy, as we start to see new digital products and services come to the fore, ensuring that these new algorithms or machine learning activities are using data in a secure and accurate way goes directly to the social nature of these organizations. And then ensuring that the G, the governance of those activities, that they're in line with the overall risk appetite and ethical objectives of the organization, all the way up to the board. It's a major, major focus for organizations today, and the reporting around it will become even more robust, I predict. So to give you just a little bit more deeper insight, I would say, into how that is really playing out in the boardroom, what I've got here is results of a survey that was conducted at Gartner earlier this year. It's their 2022 Board of Directors, or view from the Board of Directors survey, on what they consider to be the top 15 business priorities in their organizations. And so you have to consider certainly the role of the board in their risk oversight view being one of the key drivers of their answers to this question. They're first and foremost there to make sure that those risks across the business are addressed and managed well. But at the same time, they're also there to ensure key stakeholders like shareholders, investors, are rewarded for the risks that they take, and rewarded appropriately. So that's what's driving what I believe the top 3 priorities that we see. And the top 3 are also highly interconnected. So you've got number one, digital tech initiatives, driving the huge level of digital transformation that is taking place and actually has been taking place as we've navigated through the pandemic to help organizations better reach their customers in newer and safer ways, but even long term, seeking to help organizations meet ESG risk objectives, being more climate friendly, certainly reduce carbon footprints by using less impactful technologies or fuel sources, if you will. But then even going into how companies are looking to grow into the future and looking to extend their markets in newer ways. And at the same time, as we all know, the workforce element has a key role to play at this very critical time coming out of the pandemic, in that the workforce is really being impacted by organizations' ability to take these new digital technologies and employ them in ways that will help employees better perform their jobs and want to work at the place that they have chosen. But also, as they move forward, the employees see opportunities for growth to grow their skills. And on the flip side, the employers or the organizations are really desperately trying to find those same skill sets that they are developing in-house externally as they grow their business in order to maintain and develop these new digital technologies. And then thirdly, with ESG, health and sustainability, similar to what I've already discussed with the key risk drivers and imperatives for 2022, ESG is directly impacted by digital and also the workforce. Newer employees, people who are looking for new jobs, certainly due to a generational shift that we see in millennials and now even with Gen Z, ESG and the way organizations behave and operate in this new world is so important. And at the same time, they want to make sure that they're working in a safe environment. So all three of these really go, I think, to the heart of the challenges that the board and the senior executive team face. And then one other thing I wanted to point out here was the fact that the top three are ahead of growth and the financial goals of the organization, which I think is great. That's not all about turning a profit necessarily. But even just after that, risk management is right up there at the top of the agenda for boards of directors. And I think what this represents, and it's certainly out of hundreds of conversations that I've had with senior executives in the last several years, is that risk management is recognized as a true value added function that organizations cannot do without. And they really need to invest more in risk management, both from a human and technological perspective, but they also need to look at new ways to approach risk management so that that value added activity can flow through all the way to the customer and to the investor through new products and services in ways that it hasn't been done in the past. And so with that in mind, a new way of thinking, I think, is really driving out of the ESG initiatives in many organizations. And we'll start first with kind of the why. Why is this so important to organizations right now? And again, as I just mentioned, it has a lot to do with the talent benefits, certainly the workforce. But number one, I have to say, it's the money. And a lot of this is being driven by just the massive amounts of money that are flowing into funds from a capital perspective. As you can see here, $20 trillion in assets under management now sit in ESG aligned funds globally. And so 20 trillion is just a massive amount of money that is available to organizations. And in their pursuit, really, of this sort of investment, they're also seeing that these funds at a broader level are outperforming the market. And in fact, 75% of ESG funds have outperformed their benchmarks. And I'm not sure about whether that is true today with what we're seeing in the stock market, but they are definitely outperforming over the long haul. And then you think about it more internally to organizations from a money perspective. Chief financial officers are really focused on ESG as it relates to execution and reducing their overall operating costs. And we see it having a major impact all the way up to 60% reduction in cost through ESG efforts. And then lowering that cost to capital, which is going to become even more important as we enter into these tightening phases on the capital side around interest rates. You see that costs of capital are somewhat lower when you factor in the ESG impact, 6.16% versus 6.55%, and every little bit helps in this environment. And then you've got the talent benefits, very straightforward here. Again, I talked about the millennials. 40% really have considered that as a key factor in making a job decision. And then on the satisfaction side, making sure that the employers themselves are managing to the goal of ensuring their employee satisfaction and their engagement in wanting to retain those employees through ESG has driven that satisfaction to new levels, and in many cases all the way up to 14% higher satisfaction levels. Second question, why do you need an integrated risk management approach for ESG and ESG risk? To describe this a little more clearly and succinctly, integrated risk management is all about helping organizations gain clarity around the risks as it relates to these three areas: technology, cyber risk being one, operational risk, so the risk associated with the business operations themselves, and then third, the strategic or the enterprise risk view, kind of that organizational wide view of risk. And what I've found over my career, but also the research that I led at Gartner over the past decade, is the fact that organizations certainly are at all levels of maturity as it relates to each of these areas, but where they really start to separate in terms of how well they're performing with risk management is how well they have linked these three areas together to better inform not only the audit, risk, and compliance professionals, but also those business partners and leaders in making more data-driven, risk-driven decisions. And so to connect these areas, it's all about the factors that I've listed here and trying to connect them in an integrated way. And so very simply, it's taking at the bottom here technology assets in the technology cyber world and taking what is typically a solid risk assessment around data, around software, around hardware, and the threats and the vulnerabilities they face, into how those assets are enabling key areas of the business or the critical business processes that are driving the organization forward and driving the results within the products and services that they're creating. And then finally, how do both of those contribute to the desired business outcome or that strategic goal that has been defined by senior leadership in accordance with the board and the board's risk appetite. And so working backwards here, it's all about the board and the senior leaders coming to agreement on how much risk they want to take, AKA the risk appetite, and having a clear understanding of the aggregated risks across the organization that are informed by key standards and metrics at the operational level, so how things are being executed and monitored on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. And then how policies and controls are helping to mitigate those risks or drive that performance around risk management. So you've got to have all of this tightly integrated to provide the full view that all the key stakeholders are looking for. So you think about that fuller view of risk and, how does that relate to ESG and what's the secret sauce here? Well, for ESG, the real focus is having an understanding not only of what you're doing directly. So you think about how on the climate risk perspective, how many standard bearers have defined climate reporting initiatives around 3 scopes. Scope 1 being very direct impact on climate risk and what organizations can control within the organization itself. Scope 2 being more indirect understanding or indirect view of impact on climate risk, starting to include those key partners, suppliers, vendors who make up the broader ecosystem of how a company produces a product or a service. And then scope 3 being the most indirect kind of impact on the climate through their activities and going all the way out to how customers might be using their products or services and whether or not those impacts can be better managed through the whole value chain, if you will, of creation. To have that 3-scope perspective, it requires an integrated view. And it requires that integrated view at the 3 levels: strategic, operational, and technology. It goes directly to what I was just describing along the scope. And it needs to be informed by some critical capabilities that you might find in an integrated risk management technology set. And you see the 5 here with a focus on risk and control and clearly documenting and assessing that risk. The action planning and the actual mitigation efforts, making sure those are well coordinated and appropriately directed by the risk. Monitoring the risk and communicating that very clearly out amongst the risk owners, but also the senior leaders and the managers. And more understanding the quantitative, not just the qualitative impact of the risk. And this is supremely important in ESG risk reporting and will become an even bigger capability in demand, I would say, for technology providers in the space. And then finally, and this is certainly, I think, probably the most critical, is incident management. So making sure that what happens, because these risk events are going to occur, but that they are not only captured, but well understood in their entirety, not only individually, but as they might relate to a given pattern of risk or related root cause, such that actions can be made in a very productive manner. And again, tying in the 3 main components focused on understanding risk from a technology asset perspective, business process perspective, and outcome perspective, kind of brings it together in a way that's better understood and better decisioned by the board of directors and senior executives. And it really will give them a full understanding, and not only understanding of the risk itself, but the potential scenarios that could be encountered as the organization looks forward to achieving those strategic objectives. And then, where we're seeing a majority of regulation come down in terms of the proposed regulation, and even some that has already been enacted, is it's really focused on disclosure of the ESG risk. So how are the risk, how completely accurately they are being reported and disclosed to the key stakeholders. And that is all driven through visibility and understanding through these 20 key features that align with the critical capabilities that you need within your technology solution. And at the core, again, I can't emphasize this enough, given that the risk events within ESG, and in particular the E of the ESG, but even in social, maybe even in, well, less so in governance, I would say more the E and the S, risk quantification and analytics is going to take the lead. And being able not only to quantify and analyze the potential dollar impact that a given risk event will have in an organization, but also applying more scenario analysis and predictive analytics such that key leaders and the board can better predict or anticipate where these risk events are going to be coming from. And in this area of risk management as it relates to business operations, it's a lot like the weather. It's never going to be 100% accurate. But having a better understanding of where these storms are developing and coming from is so much better than where a lot of companies are today in just not having the full capability to tie it all together at that aggregated level, but then decision on it, understand the various scenarios and impacts that may come from a new product or a new service or entering into a new market that brings its own unique societal and environmental risks that the organization may not just be very aware of before they launch on a given journey, if you will. So this is all key features, activities that board members and senior executives are looking for, and they're looking for it to achieve 4 key objectives that every organization faces. And you'll see in this graphic here, this is a view of the world that the board and the senior executive team require. And it's taking what we already discussed along the horizontal view here and tying together technology risk, cyber risk with operational risk and strategic or enterprise risk, and then couples it with the fact that organizations are desperately in need for a better understanding of risk as it relates to their individual and portfolios of products and services, as well as how policies and procedures are helping to mitigate the risks in that realm. All with the objectives of increasing levels of performance up in the right-hand corner here. Left-hand corner, certainly increasing resilience. Lower right-hand corner, you want stronger assurance around these given activities and better compliance in the lower left-hand corner. Those 4 objectives that tie directly to integrated risk management are 4 objectives that every business organization has, no matter place, time, or size or scope. And then within here, you'll see the 4 imperatives and risk drivers that we already talked about and how they align, but also key areas of risk that in 2022 are top of mind for all leadership teams. ESG risk is in the top right quadrant, if you will, and it's more closely aligned, I would say, with the performance objective, given its monetary impact, if you will, on an organization. And a lot of organizations are reporting their risk performance as a catalyst for better financial performance. As these new regulations start to come to the fore, I see this dot on the chart shifting more down towards the lower left-hand corner, more compliance focused, where you see SOX compliance, for example. Very similar to SOX in that, SOX at the outset was very, very well tied to corporate performance. And that was mostly in the negative realm as it related to a lot of the accounting scandals of the early 2000s, but certainly had direct tie to corporate reporting and certainly internal controls of financial reporting, and were top of mind for CFOs and CEOs as they had to attest to those reports. ESG is going to trend in a similar fashion over time. And then when you think about those key leaders, the CFO, the CEO, which you see in the upper right-hand corner here, you start to think about all the other key leaders that, have a hand in not only helping to manage the risk in their given area, but also work as a team together to better decision on the risk data that's coming out, but also help their fellow key leaders address the larger risks that the organization faces. So taking ESG risk as the example here, you'll see it's more closely aligned to the board, the CEO, the CFO, and what I have here is the CDO at the very top, which is the Chief Data Officer or Chief Digital Officer, who is right now the primary leader for these new digital products and services that we've discussed. Those folks are really keenly focused on performance, but they can't leave the other areas necessarily out of mind as they pursue their performance goals. They've got to have that very solid understanding and focus on compliance on the very far end of the chart, and working with the likes of the Chief Legal Officer, Compliance, Security, and Chief Information Officer to ensure, in 2022, for example, security is top-notch and tight, but even going forward, that they have a flexible enough infrastructure from a policy and procedure standpoint to not limit the performance of the organization and overly control it, if you will. So it requires just a keen balance across the risk spectrum here, and as the leaders work together to achieve their own goals. And the use of technology, and I know I've already talked about this a little bit, but it is going to be the enabling force behind ensuring that the senior leaders have the right information in their hands. And just to give you a few thumbnails to consider when you're putting together your technology strategy or looking for acquiring a solution, these are some things that you want to ask yourself and consider. So on the data side, being sure that you know where the data is being sourced from and how frequently it's being updated. Those two questions are key in creating the architecture, if you will, for having the right data at the right time, but also making sure that it's maintained appropriately. And then once you are assured that you have the right data, you've got to have a process and a program in place to validate it, to make sure it's truly comprehensive and accurate. And this, I think, is even greater in importance as you enter into environments that are more externally focused, that are using a lot of third parties, a lot of suppliers, a lot of vendors. And then can you explain that methodology? Is it very transparent as to how you're validating the results? And not only the data validation, but the process, and making sure that whatever process you do use, and I highly recommend that you create your own process, but that it relates to the various reporting standards, and you can show that relationship or that tie into the reporting standards, and that will naturally work its way out into having the right controls in place. And then finally, when you get to the reporting side, do you have a good understanding of the data sources and how they relate to the primary metrics that are being used to measure performance, or not only decision upon internally with key leadership, but what outside stakeholders are using to make their decisions? And can you consistently access it in ways that are, even though we're working in a highly dynamic world and environment, that can be produced on request in real time, such that you can answer any question about a given data set clearly, succinctly, and accurately. So those organizations that can answer these questions are going to be the ones that are going to win and really have that competitive edge. And what those organizations that have the competitive edge are also going to be able to do, I believe, is be able to understand where they need to apply their limited resources around these efforts. And to do that, it's understanding where in the organization the resources need to be applied in terms of how that organization is changing, not only, again, on its own, but in a dynamic environment. And so having the ability to have that integrated view of risk, not only just to manage the business, but to appropriately allocate resources so that you get the most value out of them, and you can start to narrow what we call the business resilience gap, as shown here, in that right now, most organizations have a very significant challenge at applying resources, the risk capacity, to the demand for risk resources in the business as it relates to how things are changing. And so in order to meet that demand in the most effective way, you've got to have that solid risk insight and apply the limited resource that will always be limited in a very intelligent way. So with that, I want to thank you for your time